So, what happens when you put the Buchardt S400 MkII up against the KLH Model 5 and they both gang up on the Golden Ear BRX? And with a warm welcome back to the Sound Shed, that's exactly what we're going to find out. Knowing I need to tackle reviews on each of these speakers, I thought that it might be interesting if I take a look at all three of these speakers from an objective point of view and also chat, of course, about their strengths and weaknesses from a subjective point of view. Now, getting this out of the way, I like all three of these speakers, and I don't think that we have a clear loser amongst the group. And so breaking this down into categories will probably be a huge benefit in establishing what category matters the most to you and which of these speakers might be the best fit based on how they performed within that particular category. This video is going to be measurements heavy. I understand many of you don't care about measurements, and this video is still worth watching, and I want to be able to explain why. Everything that I'm going to be talking about in this video, all of it was established long before I took a microphone to any of these speakers. The way that I use measurements is simply a tool to help me better understand things that I have heard or think that I'm hearing. And as far as how I measured everything, I use my Clio Pocket in the Sound Shed and set a gated window that's allowing me to see data as low as 200 Hertz. I'm not going to get into the whys or hows of measuring in this video, but in any event, everything that I'm going to be saying is a mix between my subjective opinion and walking you through objective data to back up that opinion. When we take a look at treble extension or information in the time domain, we need to establish bandwidth definitions that will help give us some context to work with. As an example, if I pull up the frequency response of the KLH Model 5, I would reckon many audiophiles will immediately focus their attention to the nosedive right around 15K. When seeing this, one might assume this speaker can't possibly be a bright or forward-sounding speaker. The truth is, this is a common misunderstanding. So, first definition, let's call top-end information or treble response starting at 8K and take it out to 20K. In this bandwidth, we are talking about stuff that is well past the point that I would say makes a speaker sound bright, or what I believe many audiophiles and hi-fi enthusiasts contribute to a speaker sounding bright. And when we compare these measurements to something like the Buchardt S400, we also see a bit of a nosedive with the Buchardt, but not as extreme as a KLH Model 5. Also, taking a look at information from 8K to leading up to 15K, there is a slight emphasis on this section of the bandwidth with the S400s. And again, comparing that to the Model 5s, they are indeed a little bit more linear throughout this region. So, what does this mean? Well, it means in this category, as we've already defined it, we're talking about true time domain information and treble extension. Think about things like air, shimmer, and the very top end of cymbal hits. The Buchardt S400s will show this information off more than the Model 5s. Could we then claim the S400 is the grand champ when it comes to everything within this category? Well, not if the BRX has something to say about it. Now, from 8K to around 10K, the BRX does have a slight dip in the response, and in that arena, the Buchardt will sound a little bit more lively. But after 10K, all the way out to 20K, this is where we see some legit extension and lift with the BRX. Now, from a subjective perspective, without question or doubt, the BRX does seem to offer the most air and extension of all three of these speakers. All things in the time domain do stand out with a little more authority, and when going from the BRX to the KLH Model 5, the BRX sounds quite a bit more spacious and open, which is often a trait that I hear when we have a speaker response like we see with the BRX. So yeah, in the category of time domain information, I think the BRX might be the one to beat. Okay, upper mid-range or lower treble, this is going to be the bandwidth that often makes a speaker truly bright or forward sounding, so let's define the parameters starting as low as 1200 Hertz all the way up to 8K. We have a lot, and I mean a lot of information that lives in this area, and it's also the most critical area to get right. Often speaker designers have crossover slopes in this bandwidth. In a lot of cases, we might see one of two things. Either a dip in the response due to phase issues, or a rise in the response due to stored energy or a messy crossover of frequencies piling up on top of each other. Either way, when audiophiles mention a speaker being bright, this is where we should be looking, and I'll make it even easier. It's typically right between 1500 to 2500 Hertz, where most of the bright issues actually occur. So let's pull up the KLH Model 5 and take a look. Starting around 1200 up to 2K, we see a pretty decent dip, but then we see these two peaks, one at 2500 and one at 3500. Now, seeing some peaks like this in a response isn't always the thing that we need to look at to determine if this is going to be audible, and taking a look at the spectral decay or waterfall, we have a few more pieces of this puzzle to work with. If you look, this speaker does have some trails in the waterfall that are definitely poking out, and sure enough, that one at 2500 is pretty dang pronounced. As a contrast, take a look at the Buchardt S400 in the same region, and while we are at it, here is the BRX. So, let's rip off the band-aid right now and get it over with. When it comes to looking at top-end extension, we might have assumed that the KLH Model 5 to be the warmest sounding or smoothest sounding speaker of the bunch, and my goodness me, that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is, where most bright information lives, the fundamental hit of cymbals, the top end of electric guitars, most horns, and tons of percussion, the Model 5 is easily the brightest sounding speaker of this bunch. So yeah, in this category of upper mid-range, if you are after something that sounds a little bit more refined, we need to take a second look at the S400 MkIIs versus the BRX. Alright, side by side, taking a look at their responses, a couple of things stand out. First, the BRX does have a slight rise in the response around 1200 and another at 3500. The overall response is a little bumpier than the S400 as well. Now, let's get this part right. The S400 looks pretty much ruler flat from 2500 all the way to 5500. So in this objective fight, I gotta give the nod to the S400 for showing a cleaner response overall with less peaks and valleys, and even more, a perfectly clean spectral decay. From a subjective point of view, I do find the S400 to sound sweeter in this bandwidth. Cymbal hits sound more natural and less forward, and electric guitars sound more like the real deal. The BRX is still very good in these regions, but does indeed sound a little more forward at times, and there are some details that do poke out just enough to lead to a little bit of fatigue, especially at higher listening levels. I also think the sound of the cloth dome tweeter found in the S400s just sounds more natural than the AMT or folded ribbon that the Golden Ear uses. So yeah, in this category, all things that matter about a speaker being bright, I would say that the winner, or at least the least bright sounding or most natural sounding speaker, is indeed the Buchardt S400 MkIIs. Okay, starting as low as I can measure using a gated window, 200 Hertz all the way up to 1200 Hertz, we have defined this area, which is the bread and butter of vocal content, as the midband. With this definition, let's head back to the Model 5 and take a look at its response in this region. Right out of the gate, we do see a rise in the response around 300 Hertz and a narrow peak around 950 Hertz. All the information in between, where a lot of vocals live, is pretty dang linear, and I'm going to say it's probably one of my favorite things about the KLH Model 5s. I like the way that the vocals sound on these speakers. I think that it's a lot of fun, which we'll be describing a little bit more as we dig into mid-bass and bass. The rise in the response at 300 Hertz, absolutely, hear me, absolutely adds a little bit of color to the vocals, but I'm going to be the first to admit that it's kind of a pretty color. Whenever I talk about additional bloom or meat on the bones with male vocals, these kinds of rises in the response are typically what we see. Now, I'd imagine if we could see reliable data below 200 Hertz, I'm willing to bet that we would even see more rises down even lower where some baritones sit. One thing worth noting, LOTS, which is our loudspeaker guide that everyone on planet Earth needs to watch, does not apply to the Model 5s. Indeed, this speaker does sound best when it is up against a wall, and it was indeed designed that way. So, as I mentioned, meat on the bones and a bunch of other made-up silly words, please note that this is with the speaker about 12 to 18 inches away from the front wall. As for the S400 out of the gate, we do start with a very slight rise in the response and a dip at 500 and a rise that spans between 600 to around 850 Hertz. For the most part, the response is pretty smooth, and the only thing that I can say from a subjective point of view is right where that response or where we see that rise in the response is, there's not anything that I'm hearing that sounds bad. In fact, I love the way that female vocals sound on the S400s, and I'm guessing that some of the information is standing out more than others because of that slight emphasis in that area. The dip at 500 is a little bit odd, and even when I shot the vertical response on these speakers, I didn't see much of a change in that area as I moved the microphone up and down, so it's really hard for me to say what the heck is going on here. Now, in contrast, the BRX has a bit more of an aggressive dip as shown here around 550 Hertz and a more aggressive peak at 750 Hertz. These more aggressive peaks and valleys definitely do show up when you're listening to the BRX, and you definitely hear it when you go back and forth between the BRX to the Model 5 and then of course back to the S400. For me, vocals on the BRX can indeed be kind of hit and miss, and I do think that it has something to do with what we are seeing here. Female vocals, again depending on where the pitch is, can sound a little bit shouty or forward at times, and in other examples, can sound a little bit soft or missing some body. When you are comparing speaker after speaker like I am, it's pretty obvious, and you don't need golden ears, which is nonsense. Please see my video on dumb things that audiophiles say to notice these differences between the speakers. So, vocal content and all things in the midband. You know what? It might be a tie between the S400 and the Model 5s, and making it easier, if you like your vocals a little bit cleaner, I would say the S400s are the way to go. If you want a little bit more meat on the bones or a little bit of coloration within the lower mid-range, then I would say the Model 5s. All three of these speakers sound to me like they perform well with mid-bass and bass, and all of them share the strength of being able to hit quite low. I think the winner in texture and tone goes to the S400s, and all mid-bass and bass textures sound the most natural to me with those speakers. Does this surprise me? Not really. The S400 does have a paper cone driver, and it does sound like it actually has one. All uprights sound clean and crisp and offer texture and tone that does a great job of rendering bass notes in a very realistic manner. A close, and I mean a very close second in this category, is going to be the Model 5s. The Model 5s also offer a paper pulp driver, and man, this one was tough. Truth be told, it's probably a tie between these two speakers, but I gotta give a slight advantage to the S400 as it just barely takes the lead in bass clarity. As for the BRX, I can't find anything reliable that dictates what the cone material is, but it appears to be a little bit heavier or dense than both the Model 5 and the S400's cone material. It's possible that it's also using a paper-based cone, but I would imagine that it has some kind of a coating or treatment on it. Either way, it doesn't sound as refined or clear as the other two in mid-bass. When it comes to big boy bass or deep bass, as I have said before, this is actually a strength in all three of these speakers, and I have little to no doubt that hitting in the low 40s is going to be a problem for any of them. To my ears, the KLH Model 5, which comes as no surprise knowing the size of the woofer and the cabinet volume, does hit the hardest, and it seems to give that classic rock and roll vibe that we all loved from the golden age of hi-fi. If kick drums and bass guitars are your jam, then the Model 5 can do it, and it can do it really well. But just as a reminder, it does need to be closer proximity to the wall to really strut its stuff. As for the other two, it's close, and both do dig down very deep, but there can only be one champ, and so I'm gonna say that champ has to be the S400 Mark IIs. These little speakers offer very low extension and give that bottom of the barrel suspense without even breaking a sweat. So yeah, while it could have been a close tie between all three of these speakers in deep bass, I'm gonna give the trophy to the S400s, knowing how well they perform, especially for their size, and even more, all of the clarity that they offer throughout bass extension. Okay, let's make this quick and easy. The fight comes down between the S400s and the BRX. As fun, and they are really fun as the KLH Model 5s are, they are also designed to be near a wall to get the most out of them when it comes to mid-bass. With that close proximity to the wall and the fact that you have a front baffle as big as a dining table, these just don't disappear like the other two speakers. They can't. Nor are they really designed to. Sure, they image well and they get a fantastic center image locked in, but everything playing outside of the speaker's location isn't really on the same level as the S400s or the BRX. As for the other two, you know what? I gotta say that it's gonna be the Golden Ears that do indeed disappear a little easier when it comes to Soundstage. It's possible that it's the cabinet design, the lack of diffraction on the cabinet because the cabinet is really well-rounded and smooth. I'm not really sure, or it might be that plus the emphasis on the top end. But these little speakers throw a soundstage like nobody's business, and they do a wonderful job of leaving you alone listening to your fake, or sometimes real soundstage. Now, the S400s are no slouch, but I'm gonna say I do think that Moz Buchardt might be prioritizing all of these sharp and clean lines that you find on the S400, and I'm willing to bet you dollars to donuts that if the front baffle had some rounded edges and everything was smooth, these might have picked more of a serious fight with the BRX. Even still, the S400s are no slouch when it comes to staging, and without a doubt, they will definitely disappear. This one is pretty simple, and it won't take long to chat about it. Both the Golden Ear BRX and the KLH Model 5s offers pretty typical parts at their price point. The KLH Model 5 does have some air core inductors and even polycaps where it's critical, but also has sandcast resistors and some iron core inductors on the woofer circuit. All in all, it's not bad, but nothing at the same time really stands out as, whoa, I didn't see that coming. The BRX also offers polycaps and air core inductors in critical locations, but again, offers sandcast resistors and some iron core inductors on the woofer circuit as well. Now, as far as the Buchardt S400 Mark II, this is a different level altogether. With both the BRX and the KLH, all of these caps and parts appear to be pretty generic, non-branded, and I would imagine the cheapest that they can get their hands on. With the S400 Mark II, we find a plethora of brand name parts, including MyFlex caps and Jansen caps. Also, not one sandcast resistor is to be found on this board anywhere. Sure, we do see some electrolytic caps. I'm not really happy about that, but keep in mind, those aren't going to be in critical locations. Also, worth mentioning, I don't see even one iron core inductor throughout the crossover, which is pretty dang impressive. So yeah, while parts quality can be perceived as a snake oil conversation, many of you guys do think the parts quality make a difference, and in this case, the S400 clearly takes the cake as the clear winner in this particular category. All right, folks, there you have it. Is there clearly a better speaker in this group for everyone? Not really. The truth is, and this is the truth, that it's rarely that simple. As we have learned here today, one speaker might excel in one area while another completely kicks tail in a completely different category. While I believe that most of you already get that and agree, I suppose one of the reasons that you all watch my channel is you want to know what Ron thinks. Which of these speakers is the winner for Ron? So, after a lot of thought and anguish with having to just pick one, I have made my final decision. It was tough, but here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, the one and the only